let's say challenging would probably be the understatement of the decade. Obviously, what we'd had all the sort of trauma of going unitary, the decision, working through as an executive, an interim executive to make that happen. And we were scheduled to go live on the 1st of April. We had big sort of razzmatazzy, celebrations planned. And then 9 days before we were due to start, we had lockdown announced. And obviously, we'd had a little bit of indication of that with some of the social distancing regulations coming in. But it still came as a bit of a shock, I think, to most people when that eventually happened. So we suddenly had a situation where rather than having lots of people in the offices, everything going on, focused around business as usual, focused around making the new council stand up, getting the new organisation in place, we had to completely change course. We actually had to suddenly say, look, we are as we are. We've got to pin the organisation, staple it together almost to make it work. We've got to step down some of our current business as usual services. Actually, we later stood them back up, but immediately we stood them down and we reprioritised and refocused the entire organisation around working from home, but also very much supporting the most vulnerable in the community, who obviously, some people, particularly the elderly, were being told to stay at home and shield. And we had to make sure that they got the food and drugs that they needed from the pharmacy or whatever. And it was a really big change.
When it comes to the response to the pandemic and how things were organised, what would you say were some of the strengths that were shown by Buckinghamshire Council as kind of an organisation, and what areas do you think you guys thrived in when it came to that response?
Well, it's interesting because you'd expect, given that we were a new unitary, 5 different councils coming together, only the top 3 tiers of management had actually been put in place. You'd think that would give us quite a lot of challenges. And in some ways, there were challenges, but they weren't actually the same as organisational challenges, because it actually gave us a real reason for coming together. I mean, suddenly, all the staff weren't worried about, which historic council they worked for, or, who they were sitting next to, or whose job was, going to be working for whom. It was all about the common enemy. The common enemy was COVID. The common goal was looking after our residents, supporting them when they needed us most. And it really brought everybody together. I had people who said to me, look, I've always opposed unitary, but it's the best thing that's ever happened to us. It's given us those resources that we need. There was an in-depth capability that the organisation had, which individual smaller district councils wouldn't have had. So it wasn't an argument about, well, this is the Aylesbury way of doing things, or this is the Wickham way of doing things, or whatever. There was just a Buckinghamshire way of doing things. And if you needed resource, you could bring people down who would be normally working in the north of the county to support in Wickham, or move them across to Amersham, or whatever you needed to do. And you almost nearly always had somebody that knew something about the topic within the new council area. So we had an expertise pool, we had a resource pool, and we had the financial strength to actually tackle some of those big issues before eventually some of the government funding started to trickle through to us. So I think it actually worked really well for us. It really brought us together and built some of that team spirit that would have taken, quite frankly, much longer to do otherwise.
And was it something from your perspective that actually benefited specifically when it came to the tiers arrangement? Because beforehand, if you were trying to arrange 5 local authorities to kind of all go through the same tier restrictions and make sure your messaging is the same, by chance, it was already one authority that could give one message to the whole county. So was it, although obviously there's not many benefits to coronavirus, was it actually something that worked in favour when it came to the tiers arrangements, whether or not it was tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, etc.?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, it's slightly mixed, because there were various individuals who said, look, I'm running a coffee shop in Buckingham. Why should I be forced to have restrictions just because somebody in Burnham, at the other end of the county, may have a higher infection rate because they're closer to somewhere like Slough? And I get that argument. But what was actually quite interesting was, over a period of not that many weeks, the infection rate began to even up. So actually you began to find that it wasn't as if it was permanently a very tightly geographically confined area. Very quickly, and particularly when we started to get the new virus, the one that started down in Kent, as soon as that started to spread very rapidly everywhere, skyrocketed up in the infection rate. And it did make messaging quite easy. I've been doing a regular newsletter to the residents in the county. We send it out to over 200,000 people, normally once a fortnight, sometimes once a week if we have to, keeping them updated with what's going on, what the infection rates are. More recently, of course, the rollout of the vaccine, where the vaccine centres are, which groups are now eligible for the vaccine, but also messaging around what the restrictions are and so on. That messaging was very easy because we actually could access a lot of people. We could give a consistent message to people, and we didn't have the sort of slight parochialism of my town versus your town as we got into the mainstream of the infection.
Of course, there is lots that can be praised when it comes to a local reaction, but there are some criticisms that people have kind of levied against kind of everyone in this situation. And I think particularly for the areas that we cover, it is about the services that had to be suspended or the reaction to that. So obviously you touched upon the idea that it was a necessity, but what would you say to people who were kind of disproportionately affected by those services being suspended, or it affected them in a way that it may not have affected most people because it was such a big area that was having to react in the same way?
Yeah, I'm not so sure I'd take all of that. And I think there are some areas where people did feel really impacted. So, for example, we immediately had to close our household waste sites, what most people still call the tip. And that's something that so many people use all the time. There's a queue almost every weekend down at the local tip. And the moment you close that, then people start moaning, oh, I know my bin hasn't been collected and I can't go down to the tip, and oh, look at all the fly tipping and so on. And that was a problem for a period of time. And I served government personally very, very hard that we should have the earliest possible reopening of those household waste sites. And I was constantly talking to the government departments about this. Then I had to talk to the police, because even when the government said, yeah, you can do this, we were getting messages that the police didn't regard journeys to waste sites as essential journeys. And if you were seen driving to one with a lot of garden waste in the back, you could be arrested. And so we had to get everybody on board, and it was really quite tricky with all the different silos, but we got there in the end. And that was probably the biggest thing that I got lots of negative emails about. So yeah, that was a problem. And just, a couple of other quick examples: country parks. One of the things we closed early on were our country parks. But of course, when people were in lockdown, they had lots of time to go out and do exercise, particularly last summer. So we found people trying to break into the country parks or trying to cut through gaps in hedges and stuff like that. And people didn't really understand why they couldn't use them, and it was because that was part of the law. But again, the messaging on that really needed to be good. But besides that, by and large, we've coped. So yeah, we've had a few rocky patches, but I think by and large we've got there.
And obviously, most people in the county stuck to the letters of lockdown, and they listened exactly what they were saying. But having spoken to Mike Lovenberg, the superintendent for Aylesbury, he has said there are one or two individuals that would kind of go into the grey zone, or they have had to pass out a few fines from people, but mostly when they're it's a few individuals persistently breaching rules. As a whole, I feel like the area has mostly welcomed the rules and reacted well. But what would you say to the individuals that have kind of towed the line and in some cases repeatedly crossed it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I get letters, obviously, and particularly as we've gone through it, there's been a cohort of people who really think the restrictions are too draconian. This is the start of some neo-fascist state, that COVID is all a myth, and so on. And then you get the other extreme of people who, spending their life, moving the curtains backwards and forwards to try and see if the neighbours are, mixing in the garden, sort of thing, and ringing me up. So I get those two extremes. I think by and large, most people have stuck pretty broadly to the rules. So yeah, some minor transgressions, maybe a cup of coffee while standing outside with somebody, that sort of thing. But most people actually have understood how serious this is. particularly when you see on TV the wards full of people in really, really, serious health conditions, and you saw every night, particularly, over the January, February-ish period, the sort of death rates we were getting from COVID. I think most people have understood how serious this is, and that the rules were there not to penalise them, but were actually there to protect them. So I think the people who have followed the rules, I really take my hat off to them. It's been tricky, it's been challenging, it's been a question of self-sacrifice to a certain extent. You've given up a lot of your freedom and a lot of that social activity that makes us human, interacting with other people regularly and not on a screen. But the ones who have transgressed, if it's a minor transgression, and it's almost been accidental, there's a bit of me that says, come on, shape up, just get over it and come back in line. What I have a little bit less accommodation for, I guess, is the multiple transgressors, the people doing the flash mob parties and things like this, because it might be great if you're 18 or 25 and you're meeting with a crowd of other young people and you have a great time. But you have parents, you have brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents, and you could be spreading that infection to them. And they could be another statistic on tomorrow's news when they do the sort of daily body count, and if, you could be killing people quite literally. So I think there's an area of responsibility that some people have lacked. It's not a large number of people, but I would ask those people just to think really carefully. If they're not concerned about their own health, it's the health of those that actually potentially, they love their parents and grandparents.
Speaking of statistics, obviously the numbers in Buckinghamshire have begun to improve. That is by and large really thanks to the national lockdown, where kind of it's rules that have been implemented across the board. But Buckinghamshire, about 2.5 months ago, which seems to have gone very quickly, did go into a state of emergency because of the numbers and the fear that it would overwhelm the NHS. Now, I've spoken to kind of the local healthcare trusts, and they said the NHS has been operating in a state of emergency since the beginning of the pandemic, but for the county and the authority to launch that is quite a big deal, isn't it? So can you talk me through the issue of that having to be launched, and also how we've now come out of that?
Yeah, sure. We declared a major incident, and just some of the background. If you remember last summer, things had actually died away. We were right back down to incredibly low levels of infection, and it really felt like we were over it. And then as we got into the autumn, we began to see those infection rates climb and actually climb really sharply. And in some ways, people's understanding of that was quite slow to catch up with the way the infection was suddenly taking off again. So, we had people who were saying, well, we don't need these restrictions. And what I was doing every week, and quite often twice a week, was talking with the local hospital trust and saying, what's it like for you? And what became very clear very quickly was the hospital was rapidly filling up. So they were finding that their intensive care units were very, very full, that their staffing levels were dropping because people were picking up the infection themselves, or they were having to self-isolate. So they were losing staff, and at the same time, the number of people they had to take care of and the intensity of that care was rapidly escalating. And in some ways, we were slightly ahead of public perception because we could see that, and even at times the public wasn't quite up with us on that. And we reached a point where there was a real danger our local health service, our local hospitals in particular, would collapse. And therefore, we took the view as a council that we needed to do something about that. And that's why we launched a major incident. And we then allowed ourselves to work much more across the public sector. We could redeploy resources. We could move some of our social care teams into helping the hospital and so on. The fire brigade helped drive ambulances. And the whole thing really started to come together across the public sector to form effectively one team to make sure that the hospital just did not go under during that period. And we did that ahead of many other parts of the country. A little bit later, the rest of the what's called Thames Valley, that's Oxfordshire, Berkshire, followed suit on this. I think we did the right thing. We've now stood that down, which I think is a reflection that those infection rates have come down. But yeah, it was a difficult move at the time, but it was absolutely the right one.
And as we've now left that state and we're starting to ease up restrictions when it comes to the lockdown nationally, and we are going through the steps of the roadmap, what would your message be to the Buckinghamshire residents? Because as much as it is kind of a light at the end of the tunnel scenario, we were in this situation last summer, like you mentioned, where the numbers were basically down to, what they were pre-pandemic, before the first lockdown. So what would your message be to people as we start to progress now?
Well, I think it is one of following the rules again. It's very easy, and I've been out, walking and cycling recently, and I've seen, quite frankly, quite large groups of people, socializing again, particularly when the weather's good. There's feeling, almost in the air that spring is here, the sun is coming out, that people are being vaccinated. It's sort of all over, and there is a little bit of that sort of summer of last year feeling again. I think the big game changer is the vaccination program, which is going incredibly well, and credit to the government for that. They took a big punt last year in investing very, very heavily in this when other parts of the world didn't, and that's why we're ahead of the game. And the fact we've got through most of the most vulnerable cohorts of people, the age groups, so rapidly, I think is a testimony to terrific effort of all involved in that. But it does still mean, because certainly the first jab is only like 80 to 90% effective. So in every 100 people, there'll be 10 to 20 that can still catch COVID. They may not get it as severely, but they can still catch it. So out there's a lot of people who've been vaccinated who could still be ill to some extent from COVID. And of course, there's still a large number of younger middle-aged people and young people who've not been vaccinated, and they can be ill as well. So although the death rate, I suspect, will drop, I think we could see quite a surge, particularly with schools going back and more people mixing. So I would encourage people to keep following those rules. Be patient. I know everybody wants to rush out and start reliving life again, as if nothing had happened. But if we just keep patient for a little bit longer, get ourselves to those key stages when things have really opened up more safely, then hopefully this will be a permanent relaxation, and we won't be seeing the same sort of lockdown again next winter as we've had to go through this year.